At 8:14 a.m. on December 21, 1944, on the outskirts of a frozen Belgian hamlet near the Moose River, Oberleutnant Klaus von Richter felt a sense of divine right. From the cupola of his Panther tank, the world was a canvas of white and gray, soon to be painted with the black oil of a German breakthrough. He adjusted his leather gloves, the stitching cold against his skin, and checked his timepiece. To him, the Americans were no longer an army. They were a disorganized rabble of shopkeepers en retreat. In the next 40 seconds, von Richter would be dead, while the German column advanced with the rhythmic, terrifying clatter of professional confidence. A man named Arthur Penhaligon was crouched in the rafters of a crumbling stone flour mill. He wasn't a paratrooper, a ranger, or a combat engineer. He was a 32-year-old drafted librarian who smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the rot of old paper. He was shivering so violently his teeth ached. His spectacles were fogged with the heat of his own panicked breath, and his fingers were clamped around an improvised firing wire. What happened next flipped military doctrine on its head. It was a maneuver explicitly forbidden by the High Command, a suicidal act of civilian logic applied to the cold, hard anatomy of a massacre. Before the draft board sent him a letter that changed his life, Arthur Penhaligon spent his days in the silent, dust-mote-filled stocks of the Middlebury College Library in Vermont. He was a man of volumes, cross-references, and meticulous order. He didn't think in terms of targets or ballistic coefficients. He thought in terms of spatial organization. To Artie, a library wasn't just a collection of books. It was a three-dimensional grid. He had spent a decade learning how to maximize the line of sight between mahogany shelves and how to predict the exact flow of human traffic through narrow, labyrinthian aisles. When he enlisted, his instructors at Fort Benning were fundamentally baffled. He was older, physically unremarkable, and possessed an unorthodox way of looking at a rifle range that bordered on the eccentric. While the other recruits were focused on the bullseye of the silhouette, Artie was calculating the windage based on the specific way the Kentucky bluegrass bent at 100-yard intervals. His drill sergeant called him a useless academic, and his West Point-educated officers saw him as nothing more than a clerical asset to be buried in a supply tent. They didn't realize that Artie Penhaligon didn't see a battlefield. He saw a catalog of vulnerabilities waiting to be indexed. By the third day of the Ardennes offensive, the stone bridge at St. Roch had become a slaughterhouse. The German position across the freezing water was deemed untouchable by standard army doctrine. A hidden MG-42 nest, reinforced by von Richter's Panther tank, had turned the cobblestones into a permanent kill zone. The casualty list was a heartbreaking testament to a rigid adherence to the field manual. Corporal Silas Thorne, 19, from the rolling hills of Ohio. He died in the first 3 minutes of the dawn assault, attempting a textbook flanking maneuver that the German gunners had anticipated for weeks. He left behind a 6-year-old daughter who would keep his last letter, a promise to teach her how to ride a bike that summer, tucked in a cedar chest for 60 years. Private First Class Leo Russo, 21, from the north end of Boston. He was killed by a sniper's single round while attempting to suppress the bunker from a recommended cover position. The manual said the stone was thick enough. The German 7.92mm armor-piercing rounds said otherwise. As the bodies lay stiffening in the freezing slush, Captain Sterling, his uniform remarkably clean despite the chaos, his boots polished to a dull shine, refused to deviate from his training. He ordered a third frontal assault, citing aggressive initiative from the handbook. When Artie timidly suggested that the geometry of the bridge was being fundamentally misread, Sterling threatened him with a court-martial for insubordination and unauthorized tactical interference. Artie watched the carnage from the shadows of the flour mill, his mind involuntarily sorting the data. He noticed a tiny flaw the West Point strategists had completely missed. A 4-inch gap in the bridge's ancient stone masonry, an old drainage culvert meant for runoff. If a weapon were placed at a precise 43-degree downward angle from the mill's third-story ventilation slot, the line of fire would bypass the Panther's impenetrable frontal armor and strike the thin, vulnerable plating of the engine deck. It wasn't a shot found in any manual. It was a blind spot in the mechanical anatomy of the German advance. That night, Artie went rogue. He waited until the exhausted, hollow-eyed soldiers slept and Captain Sterling had retreated to the relative warmth of his map tent. In total silence, moving with the practiced stealth of a man who spent years not waking students in a reading room, Artie dragged a captured German MG-42 and 3 heavy belts of ammunition into the mill. He had no spotter. He had no support. He worked by the dim, flickering light of a pocket watch, calculating his distances not in yards, but in volumes of space and the structural integrity of stone. The morning air was thick with the smell of fermented corn and the sharp metallic tang of deep frost. Artie's fingers were so numb they felt like wooden pegs. He could feel the mud sucking at his boots even on the wooden floorboards of the mill. He waited, his eye pressed to the iron sights. At 8:15, von Richter's Panther roared to life, spitting blue exhaust into the white air, 480 yards, 14 inches off the ground. Artie adjusted the tripod legs by a fraction of a millimeter. He wasn't looking at the tank as a machine of war. He was looking at it as an index point he had already memorized. The Springfield kicked. No, it was the German MG-42, turned against its makers. The first burst didn't hit the soldiers, it hit the stone culvert. The ricochet, calculated to the inch, redirected the lead stream directly into the Panther's fuel line. A geyser of orange flame erupted instantly, turning the tank into a funeral pyre. Short, punchy, lethal. Artie shifted his fire. The German infantry, including Gefreiter Hans Weber, scrambled for cover that simply didn't exist from this elevation. Artie didn't spray the area wildly. He used the Dewey Decimal of the bridge. He exhaled halfway, held the freezing air in his lungs, and squeezed. The lead scythed through the column with terrifying precision. The Germans, trained to fight soldiers following a known script, could not comprehend a shooter who understood the geometry of the ricochet. By the time the mill went silent, 54 German soldiers lay in the mud. The bridge had been held by a man who usually spent his Tuesday mornings shelving poetry. The immediate result was staggering. The German advance in the St. Roch sector was halted for 48 critical hours, allowing the 101st to solidify their lines and saving the lives of over 400 retreating Americans. In 1948, the U.S. Army officially adopted the defensive urban overlook technique into its official doctrine. They credited it to a technical study group at West Point. They never mentioned the drafted librarian from Middlebury College. Arthur Penhaligon didn't care for the credit. He didn't want a silver star. He wanted a silent room and a hot cup of tea. After the war, Artie returned to Vermont. He didn't join the VFW, and he never marched in a parade. He didn't tell stories at the local pub, even when the other men boasted of their exploits in France. He simply put on his wool cardigan, picked up his date stamp, and went back to the stacks. He had cows to milk and books to catalog. He lived the rest of his life in the quiet, a man who had once rewritten the laws of war with the logic of a librarian, and then simply closed the book forever. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories.